While hiking in a remote corner of Appalachia, I found a tiny wooden cabin that wasn't on any map. The door was padlocked and the windows boarded up. All around it were dozens of little wooden crosses stuck into the ground, maybe 100 of them. Some had names carved in. I backed away slowly and left the area without looking back. I was several miles deep in a national park when I found a rusted mailbox nailed to a tree. Inside was a journal, completely dry and intact, filled with handwritten stories from other hikers who had found the same mailbox over the years. One of them mentioned seeing a light in the trees that followed them for half a mile. I didn't wait to see if it would follow me too. I once found a working generator powering a lone lamppost in the middle of a forest in Oregon. No signs, no fence, no building. Just one tall street lamp glowing softly in a perfectly circular clearing. The generator looked new and well maintained. I didn't hear a single bird while I was near it. On a desert trail in Arizona, I found a row of mannequins dressed in business suits, standing in the middle of nowhere, facing east. Their faces were blank and faded from the sun. One of them was holding a suitcase. It looked like some surreal art project or a bad omen. I didn't go any closer than I had to. While hiking through a valley in Montana, I found a wooden bench facing a stone wall. No trail, no markers. Sitting on the bench was a pair of clean hiking boots with fresh laces. Next to them was a note that said, "If you sit here long enough, you'll see it too." I didn't sit. I was hiking in a forest in Eastern Europe when I wandered into a fog-covered section of woods. The fog never lifted. I walked for what felt like days, and my watch stopped working. No matter which way I turned, the landscape never changed. I finally just sat down and waited. After a while, I heard footsteps. A man walked up, handed me a lit lantern, and said, "Don't stop moving now." I followed the light, and within half an hour I was back on a road. I never saw the man again. While hiking through dense woods in Maine, I stepped off the trail to photograph a bird and lost my sense of direction. I thought I was heading back the same way, but the trees and terrain all blurred together. I started leaving pieces of bright tape from my pack on branches. An hour later, I walked past one of my own markers, one I knew I had placed behind me. I panicked. I sat down and focused on sound. Eventually I heard cars, very faint. I walked toward it nonstop for 2 hours and hit pavement. I went solo camping in the Sierras and woke up to find my tent surrounded by snow. The trail was completely covered. I packed up and started guessing based on the slope and direction of the sun. I ended up in a valley I didn't recognize with no signal and dead phone battery. I walked until nightfall and started whistling regularly just to make noise. At some point after dark, I saw a flicker of a headlamp. It was a group of hikers setting up camp. They shared food and gave me a spare map. I camped with them and made it out the next day. I once got lost on a multi-day hike in a national park after misreading a fork in the trail. I kept going, thinking I'd reconnect with the main loop. I didn't. I was 2 days overdue when I finally found a rusted trail sign mostly buried in leaves. It pointed toward an old service road I hadn't even known existed. I followed it and eventually found a group of dirt bikers who let me hitch a ride to the ranger station. The rangers were already organizing a search party. I went off trail to explore some rocky formations and couldn't find my way back. The rocks all looked the same from every angle, and there were no trees to mark progress. I eventually sat down and listened. That's when I heard distant laughter. I followed the sound and came across a couple of hikers resting near a stream. They were laughing at a podcast. They let me tag along back to the main trail. I've never been happier to hear someone else's earbuds in the wild. I once saw a cloud form in reverse. It was like fog was being pulled up out of the ground instead of settling down. It gathered slowly, then spun into a tight spiral and rose into the sky. The moment it disappeared, I heard a loud cracking sound, like a tree snapping, but nothing fell. I was in the middle of an open field. No trees nearby. I watched a waterfall in Yosemite freeze mid-drop for about 5 seconds. Not actually freeze solid, more like time stopped. The water just hung there in strands, not moving. Then it suddenly resumed like someone hit play again. The group I was with all saw it. We just stared at each other afterward in total silence. No one ever explained it. On a mountain ridge in Alaska, I saw a herd of caribou crest a hill at sunset. The wind kicked up, and their fur shimmered like gold in the light. As they passed, one stopped, turned, and stared directly at me. For a moment it felt like we understood each other. Then it moved on. I've never felt more connected to the world than in that moment. I once passed a group of trees that were humming. Not wind whistling or insects, a low, constant hum. I pressed my ear against the bark, and it got louder, almost like a machine buried deep inside. When I came back through the area later that day, the hum was gone. Dead silent. I still think about that sound. Hiking through a misty valley at dawn, I watched the fog curl and form shapes in front of me. At one point, the mist looked like a woman in a flowing dress, walking toward the tree line. I stood frozen as she faded into the branches. I blinked, and she was gone. I told myself it was pareidolia, but part of me still wonders. What's the most unexpected thing you found miles from civilization? I was backpacking through the Rockies when I came across a payphone, just standing there in a small clearing, mounted to a wooden post. No wires connected to it. The plastic cover was cracked, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a handwritten note taped to it that said, "Out of service. Try screaming." In the middle of the Mojave, I stumbled upon a perfectly intact diner booth, 2 red vinyl seats and a Formica table, just sitting out in the open desert. There was even a fake menu laminated on the table, with items like moon soup and cactus hash. No building, no trailer nearby. Just the booth. I sat down and had lunch there, and when I looked back an hour later from the ridge, it was gone. Deep in the forests of British Columbia, I came across a rusted-out vending machine standing alone under a tree. The power cord was wrapped around the base, and it still had old snack labels inside. I thought it was just junk until I heard it hum softly when I walked past. When I touched it, the light blinked on for a split second, then nothing. I didn't stick around. While hiking remote backcountry in Alaska, I found an ancient pickup truck covered in moss and vines, half buried in a ravine. The weird part was the cooler in the backseat, completely clean, and filled with dozens of sealed water bottles that were still cold. I was 2 days from the nearest road. There were no footprints or tire tracks, just that truck, like it had landed there. On a long solo hike through the Utah desert, I came across a child's tricycle perfectly balanced on top of a tall, narrow boulder. It looked like it had been placed there deliberately. There was no path, no marks, no way someone could have pushed it up. It didn't fall even when the wind picked up. I have no idea how it got there. Have you ever run into a stranger on the trail who gave you a bad feeling? I was hiking alone in the Adirondacks when I saw a man coming toward me on the trail. He was wearing a full suit, completely out of place, and carrying a briefcase. He didn't say anything, just nodded and kept walking. When I passed him, I glanced back. He had stopped and was staring at me, still holding the briefcase, not moving. I picked up my pace, and when I looked back again, he was gone. While doing a solo overnight in the woods, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of someone whispering outside my tent. It wasn't mumbling, it was deliberate, slow speech. I couldn't make out the words. I stayed perfectly still. Eventually, the voice stopped. When I got out in the morning, there were boot prints circling my tent. I never saw who it was. I was out with my dog on a remote trail in Montana when we passed a guy sitting on a stump, completely motionless. He didn't respond when I greeted him, just stared straight ahead. My dog, who's usually friendly, growled the entire time we passed. We kept walking, and about 20 minutes later, I looked back and saw the same guy in the distance, standing in the middle of the trail. I never heard him follow us. I met a man while hiking who asked if I'd seen the lights in the trees. I said no, and he got very close, too close, and whispered, "They're watching you now." Then he turned around and walked back the way I came. I waited 10 minutes and went the long way back to my car. I still think about his face sometimes. He wasn't scared. He looked happy about it. I stopped at a trail shelter during a long hike and found someone already inside. He was carving into the wall with a pocket knife. I said hey, and he didn't look up. I asked if he was okay, and he said, "They're coming tonight." I backed out of that shelter and hiked 5 miles in the dark to the next one. I don't even remember how tired I was, just that I needed to be gone. People who've gotten lost while hiking. What happened and how did you get out? I was hiking alone in the Smoky Mountains and decided to follow a side trail that wasn't marked. It was narrow and overgrown but looked recently traveled. After about 30 minutes, it vanished. No markers, no footprints. I turned around, and the way I came had disappeared too. Everything looked the same. I walked in circles for what felt like hours before I heard voices. I followed them, but there was no one there. Eventually, I heard rushing water and followed it downstream until I hit a ranger access road. I was in Colorado, hiking with a friend, when a sudden snowstorm rolled in. The trail vanished in minutes. We had no cell service and visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet. We followed our compass the wrong direction for hours and ended up completely off course. We spent the night in a hollow under a fallen tree, rationing a granola bar and 1 water bottle. In the morning, we climbed to higher ground and caught a glimmer of sunlight off a ranger tower. Took us another 3 hours to reach it, but that's what saved us. I got turned around in a desert canyon after taking what I thought was a shortcut. It was late afternoon, and everything looked the same. No landmarks, just sandstone walls and dry brush. I had no signal. I climbed to a ridge, hoping for a better view, and saw nothing but more rock. Just as the sun was setting, I heard a weird mechanical whine. I followed it and found a trail maintenance crew working on a generator. They said I was 5 miles off trail. I don't even remember how I got that far. I was backpacking alone in Washington state and decided to make camp by a lake I saw on my map. I hiked all day and still didn't find it. My GPS started glitching, showing impossible elevation readings. When night fell, I realized I had no idea where I was. I climbed a tree and waited for sunrise. In the morning, everything looked totally different. I finally found a trail marker, but it was from a different trail system entirely. I had somehow crossed into the next wilderness zone without realizing it. I once followed the wrong trail markers while hiking in a canyon system and ended up in a dead-end ravine. I had no way back up and no rope. I tried to retrace my steps, but I kept running into dead ends and cliffs. I had one flare in my pack, fired it, and waited. Nothing. 3 hours later, I saw a drone buzzing overhead, part of a ranger training drill. They spotted me and guided a team in to help. I never ignored trail maps again. I was hiking alone in Arizona when I found a tree covered in shoes. Dozens of them. Old and weather-worn. All tied with red string and hanging from the branches. There was a note pinned to the trunk that said, "For those who can't finish the walk." I didn't see anyone else on the trail for the rest of the day. While hiking in West Virginia, I saw what looked like a person watching me from a ridge, tall, unmoving, wrapped in a cloak. I waved. It didn't respond. I kept hiking, and every 10 to 15 minutes, I'd catch another glimpse of it farther down the trail, always just barely visible through the trees. After 2 hours, it was gone. I camped deep in the forest in Oregon and found a set of wooden stairs leading nowhere. They were just standing upright in the middle of a clearing, completely clean. No moss, no wear. I took a picture, turned around, and when I looked back, they were gone. I thought I'd imagined them, until I checked my phone. The photo was there. I once followed a trail marker that led me off the main path and into a gorge. After 20 minutes, I realized the markers were made of cloth, not paint, and they weren't official. I turned around and they were gone. All of them. It took me 2 hours to find my way back. When I returned, I found a small pile of stones stacked where my pack had been. I was resting on a ridge in the Appalachian Mountains when I heard someone crying. I followed the sound for a bit and came across a man crouched by a tree, hands over his face. I asked if he was okay. He looked up and it was my face. I don't know how else to describe it. Same eyes, same jawline. Then he stood up and ran into the woods. Hikers, what's the creepiest thing you've ever encountered alone in the woods? I was hiking in northern Maine when I found an abandoned campsite about a quarter-mile off the trail. The tent was collapsed, the fire pit was cold, and there was a pair of hiking boots sitting upright beside a sleeping bag, zipped up, and empty. There was no one around, and it looked like it had been left untouched for weeks. I reported it, but never heard back from the Park Service. I was hiking in the Pacific Northwest and took a break to eat on a fallen log. I kept hearing soft footsteps behind me, crunching leaves, then silence, then crunching again. I turned around multiple times and saw nothing. Just as I stood up to leave, I heard a low whisper right behind me say, "Go now." There was no one there. While hiking solo in Utah, I came across a stone structure tucked into a cliff wall that wasn't marked on any map. It was maybe the size of a small shed, and there were symbols painted around the entrance in what looked like dried blood. Inside were animal bones, perfectly cleaned, and a ring of blackened candles. I didn't stay long. I set up camp along a remote section of trail in Colorado. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing right outside my tent. It circled around me slowly. I didn't move or make a sound. After about 10 minutes, it stopped. In the morning, I found huge paw prints all around my tent, like a mountain lion had been pacing. I never even heard it leave. I was hiking late in Shenandoah and stopped to rest at a rock outcrop. I pulled out a flashlight and noticed something white in the bushes. It was a ceramic doll, missing one eye, just sitting on a tree stump. It hadn't been there when I passed the same spot earlier that day. I left immediately and hiked out in the dark. What's the most amazing or unexplainable thing you've seen while hiking? I was hiking through a dense forest in northern Oregon when I saw sunlight pouring through the trees in a perfect beam. Inside the light, thousands of tiny white feathers floated gently, suspended like snow. I stepped into it, and all sound vanished. No wind, no birds, just complete silence and feathers drifting in slow motion. I stepped out, and the world came back. I never figured out what caused it. While night hiking under a full moon in Utah, I saw what looked like a giant silhouette standing on top of a ridge. It wasn't moving. Just perfectly still, tall, and human-shaped. I stared at it for a solid 10 minutes. Then, all at once, it slowly turned and walked away. But it didn't make a sound. The ridge was made of gravel. I should have heard every step. In the Smoky Mountains, I came across a field of wildflowers with no trail leading to it. It was completely untouched. In the middle of the clearing, there was a perfectly round patch of blackened earth, like it had been burned, but nothing around it was damaged. It looked like something had landed there. The air smelled like ozone, and there were no bugs or birds in the area. I left without touching anything. I once saw a ball of light drift across the trail about 50 yards ahead of me in total silence. It hovered for a moment, then shot upward into the trees and vanished. There was no noise, no flicker. Just a steady, glowing orb the size of a basketball. I thought I imagined it until I met a hiker the next day who said, "Did you see the light too?" Hiking in Arizona, I watched a dust devil move across a dry wash and then stop completely in front of a saguaro cactus. The air around it shimmered, and then the dust settled, but there wasn't a single track left behind. The ground was smooth, like nothing had passed through. When I touched the cactus afterward, it was warm like metal. On a foggy morning hike, I passed a man carrying a shovel over his shoulder. No backpack, no water, just the shovel. I joked, "Burying treasure?" And he looked at me with a dead expression and said, "Something like that." I smiled awkwardly and kept walking. A few minutes later, I turned to check if he was still on the trail. He wasn't. I didn't hear him leave. I ran into a guy who asked if I had seen any others out there. I told him no, I hadn't seen anyone for miles. He said, "They're right behind you." Then he smiled and walked off. I turned around. No one was there. I stood still for a while and then kept moving without looking back again. One time while camping solo, I woke up to footsteps near my tent. I called out, thinking it was another hiker. A voice answered, but it was my voice. Same pitch, same tone. It said, "It's just me." I didn't move. The steps eventually faded. I packed up at first light and never went back to that trail. While resting at a viewpoint, a guy sat down next to me. He started asking oddly specific questions about how far my car was, if anyone was expecting me, if I had cell service. His tone wasn't threatening, but it felt rehearsed. I cut the break short and hiked fast back to the trailhead. When I reached the parking lot, his car was still there, but he never passed me on the trail. On a long backcountry hike, I crossed paths with someone walking barefoot and smiling. Their feet were cut and bruised, and they were humming something over and over. I asked if they needed help. They said, "I'm fine now. I know what the forest wants." Then they walked into the woods, off trail, still humming. I never heard them again.